So for this Five Nights at Freddy's fan art, I wanted to go with something a little bit more dynamic. So I'm starting off by drawing a little frame here for Foxy to inhabit and break free from. Start off with any sketch by identifying the basic shapes. His head is basically two squares. His ears are basically cones, circles with triangles at the bottom. His snout's a rectangle, and his cheeks are basically curved triangles. His eyes are circles that are a little occluded. Eyebrows, he's got his cute little hairs up top. You gotta have the hairs. Teeth are a little bit more difficult on Foxy. They're cones, so they're three-dimensional objects. They're round, but they're also triangular in the way they stack together. Super important on any animatronic with its mouth open is the endo showing inside. So I left a little sketch there. Much of this will be covered in black. Body of Foxy is pretty simple. The cracks on the inside, a little bit more challenging. I hooked his hook around the door frame, so he's reaching out, and his endo hand I have breaking through the frame as well. Again, trying to give it a little bit more of a dynamic pose. I'm going to continue to sketch out some details on here before we move on to inking. Now for the inking, I'm just using a Sharpie to block in the big black areas first. This is going to help me just to kind of visualize the contrast throughout the piece. So I'm really just hitting the darkest darks and the biggest areas. Oftentimes it does help to spend a little bit of time coloring in the background. You can start to see things that maybe you don't have dark enough in your sketch or with your layers of color. So for our next step where we start actually coloring Foxy. Now for the actual line work, I'm using a micron 0.05. 0.05 is just the size, the width of the line. It's not necessary, but sort of the way I like to do things is to sketch things out with some sort of ink. The important thing is that it doesn't smudge because we are going to be erasing all of our pencil marks and then going over it with alcohol markers. So test whatever pen or marker that you're using and make sure that it doesn't smudge after it dries. The microns are great. They're pretty cheap. I got mine at Hobby Lobby for like $1.50 maybe each. They last for a good long while. They make good clean edges. They don't leak or run. They don't blow out. And they dry pretty quickly. I think it's India ink that's in it, so it's a nice rich color too. So I'm just sketching in all of these lines, and then I will go over everything with my eraser to kill all of the pencil marks. You don't really want the graphite pencil showing through your alcohol marker. It will, well, it depends on how much you build it up and what shade marker it is. There's always caveats to everything. Sometimes you do want that if you're going for more of a hyper-realistic look. But I'm not going for hyper-realistic. I want it to look representative of how it is in the game, but also with just a little bit of my style. So I'm going to continue inking it here before we start reaching for colors. And speaking of erasers, I do like to use a kneaded eraser. It's sort of like Silly Putty. They're usually gray. They're pretty gentle on the paper. I don't really like pencil erasers because sometimes it can damage the tooth of the paper or worse, leave one of those awful pink smudges behind. So clearly you can see I've grabbed a marker here and I'm going in with just, I think this is a brick red. I'm laying in some of the larger shadowed areas. A lot of this is about layering color. I'm going to use probably 10 different shades of oranges, reds, browns, and for the Five Nights at Freddy's characters, probably most importantly are grays. So the grays are going to wash things out, but I'll speak on that a little bit later. Right now I'm just looking at the reference piece because this is not an original creation, and I'm going through and putting in some shadowed areas. Because his eye is also a light source, I thought it'd be cool to use a fluorescent yellow and a fluorescent orange near the eye, kind of giving a little bit of highlights on some of the brighter areas. My thought was this is going to be such a dark piece that maybe these fluorescent colors would make it pop. Because it is a layered process, though, a lot of it does end up getting covered up, but alcohol markers are pretty forgiving as long as you're not going too dark and then trying to go light. Now is where he starts to really begin to kind of look more like Foxy. I'm going over with a dark orange color. I think this one's called French orange, maybe French vanilla. I'm not really sure. Um, I don't have Copic markers. These are Hobby Lobby's brand, Master Touch alcohol brush markers. They're still pretty good. The tips do get a little squishy and softer than I like, but they do the trick, and they're a heck of a lot cheaper than Copics. So if you're ever just curious about using alcohol markers, it's a good place to start. Hobby Lobby has these on sale every other week for 40% off, so you can get a couple packs of colors for fairly cheap. It's better than spending $500 on markers, especially if you're just experimenting with it. The snout and the belly are a little more on the tan side, so I'm going in and just blocking things in with a base color, and then I'll go back in with some texture and some different layers of shadow just to make it more interesting. You don't have to do tons and tons of layers. This is just how I like to build things up. If you watch a lot of anime, you can usually, if you look for it, you can tell the art style that they use. Like, you've seen some Dragon Ball fan art on my channel. A lot of that is just three colors. They'll use one mid-tone, then one shadow, and one highlight color. I like to use a heck of a lot more, but a lot of my fun art is more on the realistic side, so I like to kind of lean that way with everything that I do, really. So I've reached for the Sharpie again. I'm blocking in more of the black spaces because I needed to see how they looked against the brightness of the orange and see whether or not I've gone dark enough yet. I'm bolding up some of the lines inside of his mouth, some areas that my fine tip Sharpie is not going to really fit cleanly. So I'm just going back to my fine liner and making those marks around his teeth. Now it's time to reach for the grays. So I'll start off with, I think this is a cool gray 1, maybe cool gray 3. And this goes just right over top of all the other colors that I've got. And the gray is going to wash it out and give it that Five Nights at Freddy's look, that kind of dirty, kind of grimy, kind of gritty. Right there on his belly, it does look like I may have went a little bit too dark, but I'm going to bring that all together a little bit later. I've reached for my darker reddish color. This is a natural oak color. Adding more layers of shadow, because it's not all just black shadow, and it's all not just one shade of orange. Back to the grays, hitting out all of his silver teeth, hitting the pieces of his endo that are gray. This is going to be the lightest tone of gray that I'm going to use, so I kind of washed over everything with it. And here, this is a cool little trick that I like to do with Five Nights at Freddy's characters. Instead of using a 0.05, I'm using a 0.005, which is a really, really small point. And I am drawing squiggles all over this image. This is giving him a little bit of that texture. I don't know if Foxy would be furry or felty if we were to see him in real life. I would imagine he would have some sort of gritty-like texture, and he would not be smooth plastic or smooth rubber or anything like that. So I'll give him squiggles all over. Now I'm using a yellow to kind of make his snout and belly a little more yellow. And now reaching for a darker version of gray and deepening those shadows. Continue to build this up. Contrast is king. You've got to have a good range of value. Now, value is the range of shades, not just grays, not just whites, but the different shades of gray in between. Metallic pieces are always a little bit more tricky. So later on in the video, one of my last things that I will do is reach for a white gel pen and go through and draw the highlights back on, and a white paint pen to really make things pop. Now it's time to make my background a little darker. So I'm just using a big chisel tip Sharpie to carefully go around the edges and make everything more black. I wish my paper was black, but that would be really hard to get alcohol markers to show up on. By the way, Prismacolors will work like that. If you have black paper, Prismacolor color pencils will draw over it and make a really cool effect. Time to make his hands and his hook a little more metallic, blocking in the darkest shade of gray. layering over top of it with a lighter shade of gray. And then I'll probably use a little bit of black to get the shadow parts on it. But we've got some more background to do first. Now it's time for the white gel pen. So I'm going around the edges and adding highlights, adding the little ridges inside of his eye. I didn't leave those off in the beginning on purpose. I knew I would be coming back in and adding these lines around his eyes inside the socket. We've got some highlights on his eye patch, on his nose, on the sides of his head, bright shiny parts of his teeth, the edges of his jaws, all of the brightest areas, the shiny parts of the metal, they all get just a little freshened up with a white gel pen. It does a pretty good job of covering over. It's not perfect and it will smudge. This is a Jelly Roll brand, but it does the trick. And it really, really does help bring your artwork to the next level. At a certain point, you can always quit and make it a noticeably recognizable piece, but there's usually a few more steps that you can take. And really, I think some of the big differences between artists is where they draw that line. Where do they stop? Where do they say this is good enough? And where do they say, okay, I can do a few more layers? Now, I used a white paint pen to add some super highlights to his hands, and then I smudged it with my finger to try to give it a little bit of a shiny effect, as if the light is reflecting off of it. And I'm just spending a little bit of time going around the whole piece, lightening everything up, lightening up his eyes, and trying to make it pop. Throw on the signature at the end, give it a little beauty shot, and call it a day. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please comment, let me know what you think.